Joining me now is former federal prosecutor and author of License to Lie, Sidney Powell. Sidney, great to see you. Of course, your book is largely about the shortcuts that a lot of prosecutors take. Knowing prosecutors, as you do, particularly this one, Robert Mueller, what do you think he is more interested in, getting to the truth or just getting Donald Trump?
Well, ever since he hired Andrew Weissman and brought him on this task force, I've known that he has absolutely no interest in seeking the truth whatsoever. Mr. Weissman is the lead villain in License to Lie, which is nonfiction. It's all true, and it names names, including those of other high-ranking Obama administration people who show up in the page-stroke text messages and other places in this investigation. So no, he's not interested in getting the truth. He, I think, is part of the insurance policy that was concocted with McCabe, Stroke, Page, and others to destroy the president, which is why he's also featured on the T-shirt at my website, Creeps on a Mission.
So why should anyone, not just the president, but anyone, cooperate with somebody who's out to get their scalp?
Well, I understand why the president wants to, and I appreciate the fact he has been the most transparent president in long history, but I would not allow him to do that under any circumstances were I advising him. You just simply cannot trust that environment to produce anything other than an indictment for the slightest misstatement. I mean, look at Mr. Papadopoulos, who simply gave a wrong time frame for some of his conversations with people and wound up being indicted.
Well, meanwhile, the real collusion story, the story of the collusion between the FBI and the DOJ and possibly even the CIA over the Trump dossier and Christopher Steele, the author of that dossier, and Fusion GPS, funded by Hillary campaign. That collusion story continues to get fleshed out more, and some of it surprisingly came from Bruce Orr's testimony, even though a lot of people thought he would just clam up. But he, the husband of a woman who worked for Fusion GPS, was the one who was spreading the Trump dossier even before the FISA warrants were issued by the FBI. That is, the FBI knew about his relationship to Chris Steele. He was quite open about that before they issued the FISA warrants, something that they should have put in the FISA warrants, no?
Oh, yes. They left out a lot of information that should have been included. Well, in fact, since the entire thing was made up, there should never have been any FISA warrant applications to begin with. I think Nellie Orr, we will find, had a much greater role in this than we know now. It wouldn't surprise me to learn that she actually had as much role in writing the, quote, Steele dossier as Mr. Steele did, because she was working for Fusion GPS, who I believe we'll find, if we get the FISA court decision unredacted and unclassified, was one of the private contractors to whom Comey gave unfettered access to the raw NSA intelligence database in 2015.
Well, Sidney, let me just jump in if I can, because a lot of people have been pressuring the president to declassify everything as though it would be a snap of the fingers for the president to do that. However, there is a hangover, an executive order hangover from the previous administration that might make it so that it's not that easy for the president to declassify, no?
Well, there are a lot of considerations that go into declassifying something, the main thing being national security and the presence of any, quote, sources or methods, they call it, for the information that need to be protected. But it's not that hard to read these documents and tell what really needs to be kept secret versus which is a cover-up of information that the taxpayers and the public are entitled to know. So
but is our President Trump's hands now tied by an executive order that prevents declassification by President Trump?
No, he can undo that executive order. Anything Obama did by executive order, President Trump can undo by executive order. He just needs to be mindful of the considerations that warranted the executive order in the first place.
Speaking of President Obama, it's a little off track from your book and your particular expertise, but I'm wondering, his outrageous, I would call it, attack, certainly unprecedented attack on President Trump. Most presidents in my lifetime have had the decency to be quiet about the successor, even if they totally disagreed with what their successor was doing. This president is obviously breaking with tradition. What do you think about that?
I was absolutely appalled. It is a 200-plus year tradition of silence for the past president to allow the new administration to do what the voters wanted it to do without that intrusive interference. He paid lip service to that in his speech and then proceeded to absolutely destroy it. He just walked all over and spit on that tradition. It's nothing short of outrageous and appalling.
Do you think there will be blowback from this?
I hope there's blowback. I mean, as best I can tell, the Democrats have the donkey as their logo for a reason, and most of them are acting like the southbound end of the northbound donkey.
I can't approve on that. That's got to be the end of this conversation. Sidney, great to see you. Thank you very much for being here. Sidney Powell, we appreciate it.
The real story here is not that this case isn't going to fizzle. It's going to blow up on them. The real question is what we talked about before. There's a lot more to what they did that nobody knows about yet.
I know some of it.
A lot more to the obstruction of justice, to the collusion, to the fake dossier.
Oh, I know a lot.
Trying to bring Steele back in after he was completely discredited.
And then feed it to Mueller.
Yeah. And Mueller is going to have a lot to answer for.
Mr. Mayor.
I said a long time ago, the investigation here has to be in the investigators.
Okay, so that was last night. Rudy Giuliani was on with Sean Hannity on the Fox News channel saying that the investigation conducted by Robert Mueller is going to backfire on Robert Mueller. So the president's lawyers are pushing for kind of a speedy end to all this, but should we really be expecting it to drag out? That's what kind of markets are looking at and everything else. One of the reasons we talk about it. And we have former prosecutor and criminal defense attorney David Bruno here in the studio in New York with us, and the Washington Examiner White House reporter Gabby Morangiello also joins us. Gabby is in Washington. Let me start with you, Gabby, on the politics of it and the White House's side of all of this. Rudy Giuliani's back and forth there. It's obviously, or it seems obvious to me, there's some spin or there's some public relations in all this and wanting people to think that Robert Mueller's doing something he shouldn't be doing, whatever the case may be. But what have you made of what you've seen here just this week from Giuliani, Sekulow and company and what they're trying to do?
Well, it's an interesting strategy. I mean, here you have the president's outside attorneys, claiming that this investigation is more corrupt than Watergate, but they haven't really provided any examples to back that up. I mean, we know that the president and Rudy Giuliani referenced this weird golf dispute that happened between Mueller and President Trump back in the early 2000s, but beyond that, they haven't really given any evidence as to why this investigation would be more corrupt or would have issues or conflicts of interest at hand. And I do think that they're using this sort of as a tool to prepare themselves for the possibility that if President Trump does decline to sit down for a presidential interview, that Mueller and his team are going to obviously subpoena him to testify before a grand jury. And any conflicts of interest could be used against Mueller as a weapon. The
legal question, David, that I want to talk to you about is that, how this all ends up, I guess, is to some extent anybody's guess, but it's clear if you kind of look through everything that's been said the last few days, whether it's Giuliani or Sekulow, they don't want the president, it seems, talking about obstruction of justice or being asked about it. That seems to be what this all comes down to.
Yeah, right? I think, well, first of all, this negotiation about the statement itself has been 8 months. I mean, this is the second counteroffer going back and forth with Mueller. The attorneys are telling the president, no, you should not speak. It's the president that's saying, I want to.
They're worried about perjury trap.
They're worried about perjury trap. They're worried about anything that they don't know. I mean, this Mueller investigation is so large. Just look at the Manafort indictment itself.
Right.
That goes back to 15 years ago. Has nothing to do with collusion, right? So what about the president's financial dealings? Who knows? That's why they want to limit the scope. That's why they want to control the interview. And their advice is don't even do it to begin with.
Right. Well, then, as you said, it's up to the president. He's always said that he'd be willing to sit for an interview. What he does is interesting, Gabby. We'll see what he does. At some point, I guess, the decision will have to be made. But also a decision might have to be made by Robert Mueller, right, of how to handle all of this. If the president's saying, his lawyers are basically coming and saying, hey, listen, if you think, you did, here's an item you may have thought that there was a law or rule that was broken, say that the president obstructed justice. Maybe the Mueller team thinks that. His lawyers are basically coming back and saying, well, you can't ask him about that. So, I mean, what's Mueller going to do? You think he uses subpoena power here at some point? He's going to have to make that call, right?
That's obviously the biggest question and part of this. And, you know, I think what's most interesting is that we have so much insight into what the president is thinking because his lawyers are constantly out there talking about their strategy, talking about the types of questions that would be off the table, things that involve President Trump's firing of James Comey and things that he told James Comey about Michael Flynn. But what we don't know is how Mueller's team is reacting to all of this. We really have no window into what the federal investigators are looking at to ask the president about whether or not they do plan to agree to some of the terms that have been laid out by the president's legal team. It's really, you know, reached a point where we know that the president has these conditions, but we have no idea what Robert Mueller plans to ask him about.
And we haven't throughout the whole thing with Mueller. Even when the indictments came down on the Russians, we had no idea up until he was about to announce them. This is the one place in your town, Gabby, in Washington, that we're not getting leaks out of is Mueller's office, which is kind of interesting and hard to do, David. But if you're advising, and I've heard lawyers say all the time, if I was advising the president, I'd say, do not do this interview. Is there a reason to sit down with Robert Mueller if you're President Trump at this point? Can you think of one?
Sure, PR, for PR purposes.
But what about a legal
He has
reason?
A presidential election in 2 years. You have midterms. He wants to be liked by the country. He wants to be approved. And that is the conflicting interest that the president has with what his lawyers are saying.
Do you think he can help himself politically? But there's a big legal risk there.
Absolutely, no. There's some great legal arguments that he has with the executive privilege, even the Fifth Amendment. It's a dangerous area, but it sounds like he wants to move forward. He wants to do this.
Okay, so if he doesn't,
ultimately it's his
you're getting into
decision.
some of those arguments. So let me ask you about the legalities of all this. So the subpoena could come in. So the president says, well, or his lawyers say, the president's not going to testify. Robert Mueller subpoenas him. The president then argues.
Yeah, so they would file a motion to quash in the district court. It actually just happened with Andrew Muller, who's an associate of Roger Stone. And there has to be a legal basis. In the Andrew Muller case, they said that Mueller was outside the scope of his authority. In the president's case, he would argue executive privilege, Fifth Amendment. He would lodge all of his legal objections to it. Then a D.C. district court would have to make the decision. It's an appealable issue. It could go all the way up to the United States Supreme Court.
Which it probably would, unless the president, like President Clinton did, agreed to the testimony after the subpoena.
If it goes the legal way, it's going to take time. I think it would come after the midterms. I don't think Mueller wants to affect or influence the midterms.
Real quick on that, Gabby, you think there is a political, David's making, he's our legal analyst, but he's saying that there may be some political gains for the president. You think so or no?
Yeah, I think that his base is so riled up right now and actually buys into this message that this is a witch hunt, that they would actually be more supportive of him refusing to sit down with Bob Mueller, going through the process of being subpoenaed and then bringing that all the way to the Supreme Court.
Yeah, that is
Absolutely.
interesting. We got to go, David. Thank you. And Gabby as well.